Jai Guru, everyone.
Jai Guru.
Jai Guru.
Welcome to the Autobiography of a Yogi podcast, where we're discussing the autobiography of a yogi line by line. Today we'll be doing chapter 8. And in chapter 8 is entitled, Mike, what is it entitled?
It is Jagadish Chandra Bose, India's something scientist.
Lauren, what is chapter 8 entitled?
India's great scientist, J.C. Bose.
Mike, do you see how
90% correct. You just need to change the order of my words a bit, and you got it.
We should rename this podcast accordingly. No, just kidding. We won't. But we also have Reva with us today. Hello, Reva. Welcome back.
Hey, thanks for having me, guys.
Thank you for joining us. Tell us about your love for this book.
Well, it's a book that I first read over 20 years ago when I picked it up in a bookstore in Delhi in Jadbat. And it's a book that I then reread 10 years later and now recently have read to my children. So it's a book that has a really close space in my heart and different chapters of my life, and definitely was the book that brought me onto the path.
Superb. And now you're doing a podcast about the book. So here is the lovely narrative arc to your journey with the author. What's your favorite chapter?
Oh God, I don't know the chapters off. Oh, okay, so not numbers chapter, but I like meeting Babaji, when Babaji and Lahiri Mahachaya meet in there. That story is probably my favorite story, and actually all those stories, even the Kumbh Mela story as well, is really nice.
So you're another one of those Babaji enthusiasts out there.
Yeah, I think you owe me a highlighter.
Anytime. For listeners, you don't know the background, but I've got each of the gurus' names on a highlighter, and I've appropriately started color coding the book in with the different gurus talking in a different highlightation, if that's a word. Anyway, let us start. So the chapter title is, as we had discussed, India's great scientist, J.C. Bose, which his actual name is Jagadish Chandra Bose. And we say Bose. In English, it's spelled Bose. It's said Bose. In Bengali, you might say Basu, which you may or not know. And there's many people that have a similar sounding name. And in Bengali, as I discussed previously, V's become B's. So it's from the Sanskrit Vasu, which, Reva, what's your son's name?
Vishnu.
Vishnu. So that is the derivation of his name, actually. So you have Sanskrit, then you have, like, as you go further and further out, like you have like little nuances to the language, and then you end up with, as we would say in the West, Bose. So Reva, you can call your son Bose next time.
I know.
And explain it. Reva has the most lovely children. I love them. So this chapter title, let's just break it up a bit. So to have a title that's so scientific, I think really rang true to my heart. India's great scientist. So it feels like a biographical title and a chapter, doesn't it? But if you've read it, we know it's anything but a biography of him. In fact, there's very little emphasis placed on his biography at all, isn't there? But as we said, Bose is a very famous name in science, and also even in technology. Today's technology, you might have Bose speakers, and that's a different scientist of the Bose Corporation. But it's like synonymous with excellence in a way. And I suppose that a lot of that may have started with Jagadish Chandra Bose. And there's also a very famous and very controversial politician, Subhas Chandra Bose, which he was involved in India's freedom struggle and probably a contemporary of this Bose. Mike?
It's interesting because we've been going through a round of saints for the last few chapters, right? And they were all very different and kind of their virtues, I would say. And science and religion is something that doesn't always go well together. But here, Guruji kind of makes a point that here we have someone who is saintly and who is a scientist, and he like emphasizes all the scientific inventions that he made.
Indeed, very well, very good point. And there's a parallel chapter later, Saint Amidst Roses, which Luther Burbank has a similar feel to this chapter, especially in its association with plant life. So Jagadish Chandra Bose, Jagadish is also another name for Vishnu, one of the incarnations of God, and Chandra is also one of the names for God as well, and the moon as well. So yeah, so a very distinguished name in all manners of speaking. So yeah, that's that. In terms of the title, the scientist. So I think the scientist in me, as we've discussed in the past, really loves this kind of chapter. Even from as a youth, even since I was young, even now I like to be very scientific in my approach to most things. So this chapter was very very good. And if you'd read the chapter, like the chapter spans, it goes from like physics to biology, and then even economics as well. There's essences of that in the chapter. But I remember when I was I was having some surgery done once, and a neurologist was present, and I was speaking to him about the stuff he was doing, and then he started talking about electrical signals and nerves and electrons and things like that. And I thought, oh wow, that's a deep understanding of electronics you have there, because electronics is my major. And he said, yeah, we have to study it, because obviously in neurology it's all about neurons and electrical signals. So I thought, wow, in medicine you have to study physics in the sense of electrical sciences as well. And he said, yeah, I absolutely love that. And in this chapter, we know both, he started his journey as in physics, then he went into biology. And even before that, I think he was actually going to, when he was young, he was actually going to study medicine, but then he, for some reason, moved. So yeah, so this chapter is quite a difficult one to break apart, because it's not like the other chapters. This is almost wholly scientific, isn't it? So I struggled with how we should dissect this, whether we should do it by line or by subject matter or whatever. But I think Mike suggested we stick to the line-by-line approach, didn't you, Mike?
Yeah, and it could be worse. I find the Crescograph is a very interesting invention. Guruji could have gone with other scientists. Like there's another famous Indian scientist of that same era called Bose, right? Satyendra Nath Bose, who is a theoretical physicist. I think that would make our life much worse if we had to go into I think the boson was named after him.
Nice.
Yeah.
Very nice. Yes, very true. So in terms of time frames, I have figured out that he would have been 16 during this period where he met
Mukunda,
Mukunda, where he met Jagadish Chandra Bose. But it's quite difficult to calculate because he doesn't give dates. But he does give a date as to when he met Sri Yukteswar, which is in a couple of chapters' time. And he also says that the Jagadish Chandra Bose was in his 50s, and we know when he was born. So we can deduce that Mukunda was around 16. And the reason for that why that's important is because when he's eavesdropping on these intellects and their discussion, which is the first couple of lines in the book, in the chapter, we don't know how old he was before, but if you can't imagine Reva, your 12-year-old, interjecting with a group of physics professors, maybe outside outside UCL when we were at a friend's house, when we were having that lunch out there. but so if he was 16, that is more plausible. So Jagadish Chandra Bose, it says his wireless inventions antedated those of Marconi. So Marconi is another very famous and important scientist. How do you say his first name, Mike? Guglielmo. Is that how you say it?
Yeah, you said pretty well, Guglielmo.
Oh, very nice. So I'll add Italian to my LinkedIn profile now.
Yeah, I think you passed. You graduated.
How much? Anyway.
Ask for a raise. Yeah.
Right. So he says that his wireless, Bose's inventions, antedated those of Marconi. I think that means came before. And everyone's nodding, so thank you for that. So that would mean that, and I did a bit of research, that he came up with some of Marconi's inventions before. And Marconi was very famous for essentially being the father of radio communications and transmitting signals. And apparently, he 1 year before Marconi patented his invention, Jagadish Chandra Bose actually publicly displayed it, the technology, for free, of which Marconi may have then heard about it and then patented it himself, and he became world famous as the scientist who became that. So that tells you the prowess, the intellectual prowess, and the scientific capability of both, because with wireless, technology we have, that's all pretty much stemmed from those contemporaries. So that's pretty cool. We're going to talk about commercialization actually later on, because Bose has his own take on scientific knowledge and the commercialization thereof. So that's that. And then so that's that sentence that he overhears, and then Mukunda just casually walks up to the professors and joins the conversation. So then he said his Mike.
Yeah, is that just me, or does that seem pretty confident for a young 16-year-old? Like when I was in school and there were like the professors talking about some scientific subject, I was usually not the kind of person who felt like, oh yeah, I can really add something to this conversation. But he goes in there, and then they go and try to tell him and convince him, and even encourage him to meet JC Bose, because he's one of their fellow professors.
JC, I like it. Should we call him JC from now on?
JC, yeah,
good name. Not JZ, JC. I think, yeah, like that iteration. JC. But his name's so nice, actually. Jagadish is actually a mantra. So the more we say it, as is Chandra. So the more we say it, the more we'll get closer to our enlightenment. So let's stick with Jagadish and Chandra and Bose. So yeah, so it's a cool conversation, shall we say, to interject, isn't it? But he said his motivation for joining them wasn't essentially the discussion. It was about racial pride. He says he cannot deny his keen interest in the evidence that India can play a leading part in physics and not metaphysics alone. So here comes the second of many moments of patriotic declarations and intent by Guruji. The first one was in chapter 5, I believe, when he was speaking to that saint before he met the perfume saint, and they were talking about essentially India. Yeah, so this is the second such moment, and we really think is about to keep pressing this button of the importance of Indian scientific achievement and contribution to the world, isn't he, Mike? Because as we're recording this, we just had a very significant,
proud moment
in scientific discovery. And Jagadish's middle name was what, Mike?
Chandra.
And why is that relevant?
Because there's a certain spacecraft with a certain name.
Yeah, go for it. Describe what happened and why is it relevant?
Well, India is now officially the 4th country in the world that has landed a spacecraft on the moon. Congratulations.
And it was called, what was the spacecraft called?
Was it called Chandra 5, I think?
Chandrayaan 3.
3, okay. See, almost got it right.
Yeah, so it was a very significant moment. My wife and I celebrated with great enthusiasm, and
Many have tried, few have made it. So it's like
yeah,
very,
I
Yeah,
think
and they did
quite an
it in the
achievement.
true Indian style, guys. Cut price
God,
at a fraction of the cost. We can do it, and we can do it cheaper.
and better, and better.
Yeah.
And better, because just previously, I think in the year Japan and Russia had tried to do something actually a little bit easier, but they'd crashed, crash landed, as
Yes.
did Chandrayaan 2. So there's no easy achievement, but yeah, it was good. And as you know, I posted the story of that on all of our informal channels of Guruji, and I put a quote on, you know, one of Guruji's patriotic lines on India, and how, you know, we can contribute to the world, and so that was good. So next, what happens is he says, "What do you mean?" Mukunda says, "What do you mean?" Like he's referring to the question of the statement that Bose's inventions antedated those of Marconi. And the professor obligingly explained, and this is quite funny that he's obliging, because they're having quite a intellectual conversation, I imagine, group of professors, and it's quite nice for him to oblige in the idle curiosity of a passerby, and it's pretty rare, I would say, because there's this big ego attached usually to professors around the world, not just around the world, especially in India, where they don't have the time of day. Teachers especially, they don't have the time of day to explain simple things. Mike?
Yeah. But then also you have to think that he's actually going basically to high school, right? What he's doing right now. And I don't know, is that normal to call your teachers professors in high school? Because I doubt that they are actually academic professors, right? Maybe it's more like an honorary title for them.
No, yeah, that's right. You'd call them sir. And that's what he's done. What do you mean, sir? And he's described it professor, but they could be professors. You know, he would have gone to very, very good schools, knowing his family, so they could be professors. But yeah, so it's nice of the professors to entertain him, isn't it? So the next bit is that the professors explain that the first person to invent the wireless coherer and the instrument for indicating refraction of electric waves, but that the Indian scientist did not exploit it commercially, he says. So this is an important point, isn't it? Because I mentioned that he didn't, you know, patent it. And usually science is commercialized very quickly when discoveries in virtually every area of interest are taking place, where be they, you know, wireless technology, as we're talking about here, but even medicine, you know, even you know, if they discover some cure for various things, commercialization is very often high on the list of priorities when they discover it. Mike?
But that's like more like the Western or the American way, right? To do things. Maybe he was the kind of scientist who kind of prided himself in just scientific achievement rather than commercialization of his inventions. And I don't know, maybe in a distant future it will be like that, where people will actually be lauded for their scientific achievements rather than how much money they made of them.
And he's a true scientist, isn't it? He's essentially just interested in knowledge for the sake of knowledge, as opposed to just commercialization of science, which is often the case. Obviously, there's a few exceptions around the world, but generally, like for example, it's CERN, I think, that World Wide Web started from, and but there was basically an internal network. Had they have known that it was it was going to be a worldwide phenomenon, I dare say they would have protected it, guarded it a bit more closely. Mike?
I can relate to that as Austrian. Like an Austrian invented the ship's turbine, but he never commercialized it, and so he died a poor man in the end. And an Austrian guy also drove the first motorized car, but he didn't commercialize it, and so now it's not named after him. So
that's good, man. The meek shall inherit the kingdom of God.
Yeah, hopefully.
Bible. So
it's a good thing to get as well, rather than just money.
So thankfully the Austrians are quite high achievers in this respect. Knowledge, distributing knowledge freely. Yeah. So then the next line is that the professors explained that he turned his attention to from the inorganic to the organic world, and this is a very simple line, but it's a completely different discipline. I explained earlier where my neurology, that doctor I was speaking with, he he did these modules, so he had a passing interest, you'd say, but for him to then go into work in NASA or like CERN, that's the physics essentially, that's a completely, you'd literally have to start again. But what usually happens with these exceptional talents such as Jagadish Chandra Bose is that they're very, very capable of thinking about things and applying their approach to a new discipline and just making it their own and running away with it. And that's essentially what he did. Like the Crescograph is a feat of engineering. We'll discuss it later, but it's when you have that thirst for knowledge for the sake of learning and for the sake of knowledge and for an altruistic means or selfless means, then I suppose vistas such as this will open up to you. It feels like it'll be more in tune with God's plan for knowledge, isn't it? As opposed to a narrow-minded, narrow approach where you just go straight in that direction and don't look back and don't look to the side. Mike?
I also found it interesting that he said he went to the organic world, because in the Holy Science, Sri Yukteswar says that the Dwapara Yuga is the age of botany and of plant life, and so maybe he went in there to make some of those discoveries that will further kind of be big in the Dwapara Yuga in the next 100, 200 years or something.
True. We'll see.
Yeah.
It certainly is that way, isn't it? Nowadays, the word bio has got so much of a cachet to it, isn't it? You put organic or bio in front of anything, and just suddenly has a new feeling about it. So when the professor continues, his revolutionary discoveries in plants essentially were outpacing his achievements in the physical as a physical scientist in physics. I remember just recently, we were picking some fruits near my house, and I said to my wife, "Let's go to the library." So we don't have time. I was like, "Let's just go anyway." And she said, "I only want to go to the library if I've got a book to, you've got interest in a particular book." And I was like, "Oh, she's been so engrossed in working that she's forgotten the joy of just going to the library just to browse." So I said, "No, let's go." And she's like, "Okay, fine." So reluctantly she went. And then I kid you not, because she did both, did two majors. She did a science degree and an economics degree, maths degree as well. And she as soon as we got into the library, the first rack on the right, she spent 2 hours on the first rack. And she was like, "I can't believe we haven't been covering it. It's literally, Mike, just down, where my main road is. It's less than 3-minute walk." And I was like, she's like, "I can't believe we haven't been coming here." I was like, "I know. We just occupy our time, we can make use of it better in some respects when we, increase our yearning for knowledge for the sake of learning, as opposed to a specific purpose where you want to get a book out and that's the only thing you want to do. Mike?
Yeah, there's something, I don't know, that makes me feel like a child again when I go to a bookstore or a library and then you look through all the titles. I'm also I go straight to the science books usually, or computer science or something like that. And then if I see something interesting, it's really great way to actually spend your time and do something that's actually interesting and can inspire you to do other things rather than, I don't know, spending time watching YouTube or something like that, which is much less beneficial.
Yeah. And if you really take this philosophy of just learning for the sake of learning, then somehow you get some synchronicity with whatever you're doing in your life. It could even be in your career. I found that like it leads you down some extraordinary paths that you wouldn't necessarily have gone down, even as an engineer, which you'd think is quite a narrow field, but somehow vistas open up, and it's quite nice because when you reflect, you're like, how did I end up here? But it's with the it's with that it's the mindset that takes you there, and then you can have a much more fruitful life, I suppose, if you allow yourself to have this kind of approach. So the next line is that he says that Mukunda thanks this time he calls him a mentor, and he says the mentor then says the great scientist is his brother professor at Presidency College, and the great scientist he was indeed. So he says that Mukunda says that the very next day he visited the sage in his home. Mike?
I think that again speaks to what kind of personality Mukunda already was at 16, that he just goes there as a 16-year-old to this probably very famous, revered scientist and just and then he's probably happy to see him. He's probably a person like Yogananda is very, very humble in describing himself in the Autobiography of a Yogi. I'm sure everyone in that school knew about him, and he was a radiant personality, and he was probably thrilled to have him over, the scientist.
Indeed. So it's also that he so readily accepted this invitation. So this was the very next day. So if you can imagine, so Mukunda's father must have been very well connected. So I can imagine he may have helped set up this this meeting. But for Jagadish Chandra Bose just to accept this meeting with 1 day's notice, there's something in that. So firstly, Mukunda spoke to these professors, and these professors obligingly shared their knowledge. The second day, he got an appointment with Jagadish Chandra Bose, who welcomed him essentially. So if you tried this with a random group of professors and then the most famous scientists of today, I don't think you'd be able to achieve this, would you? Through chance encounters. But herein lies the difference of Mukunda, because he's so well in tune, and his life has got a very divine purpose and a path. Because as we will get later on in this chapter, he's going to talk about Jagadish Chandra Bose's experiments and his inventions, and they very much influence Guruji's life in terms of not just his teachings and how we do our practices in terms of healing and things like that, but also who he meets later and further kind of emphasizes the importance of it. Like we said, he met Luther Burbank later. I feel like these meetings that he had in his childhood really then made other meetings that he made with, for example, professors in America and famous biologists such as Luther Burbank later on. Then really those just came together perfectly dovetailed with his You can imagine him being able to freely discuss the Crescograph with Luther Burbank, and then Luther Burbank no doubt would have read Jagadish Chandra Bose's papers on this, and therefore then they'd have an instant connection. So he's got a very divine purpose, and these kind of chance, I quote, chance encounters aren't necessarily chance, they're more divine decree, shall we say. So yeah, so apparently his home was very close to his, like another coincidence. But he had long admired him from a respectful distance. And that's not necessarily to say, yeah, Lauren?
Oh, you can carry on with your sentence.
That's not necessarily to say that he'd, been up to date with his research, but more that Professor or Jagadish Chandra Bose was quite famous. So he would have appreciated and respected him from perhaps the papers or, in school conversations and things like that. Lauren?
Yeah, you can imagine him, can't you, sort of respecting him from afar. It must be really, really lovely. But I also wanted to highlight that he calls him a sage, not I visited the scientist, I visited the sage. And I feel like that was such a lovely blending of sort of like the two worlds that do exist as one. But, for a reader, we've had many chapters before this, which are very of the spiritual. And then we have this scientist section, which is very appealing to the intellectual mind, the person who really connects with, science and facts. I know I do. So actually to call him a sage, I feel like such a lovely way to just ease it all together and flow it through.
Very, very astute observation, actually, because just in the next few sentences, the importance of that word will reveal themselves. Reva?
Yeah, just to echo Lauren's point there, I actually felt that actually confused me and it threw me off a bit when I was rereading this the other day, because I was like, wait, hold on, who did he go and visit? I thought he wanted to go and visit the great scientist. Is there somebody else in here? So then I was like, no, wait, he is talking to him. He's talking about Bose, but he's referring to him as a sage. And then I thought, it took me onto a little bit of a wider kind of meta thought about the autobiography in general, which is it's really amazing how Guruji's written this book, which is a retrospective account of his life with so much detail. He's got the most exceptional memory for sure, but to be able to, what he's done really well is blending the kind of real-time experience with these visceral details of how someone looks and what the conversations were. So it's like a show, not tell. But he's also then placed one more thin layer on top of it, which is of interpretation. So at that point, he probably didn't think he was a sage, or maybe he did, right? But then, we don't know if he did or not, but he's taking us by our hand through this by saying the guy was a sage. So I just kind of like the balance of retrospective and real-time storytelling. I didn't realize that so much before, but I thought that was quite clever.
Very nice. Very clever indeed. Because then he goes on to describe him as a grave and retiring scientist, botanist, essentially. But he greeted him graciously. And Mike?
Yeah, I wonder, it's a good observation to say that he describes him as a sage. And do you think he also was a sage in the sense that he had a spiritual guru and was following a spiritual routine? Or was his sagelihood, or however you say that, based more on his scientific approach and he dedicated all of his kind of energy into science, and that somehow also another way, maybe it's that how do you call it, jnana yoga way to saintlyhood, maybe it's something along those lines.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I tried to find if he was belonging to any spiritual path, and I couldn't find it. But there's articles out there that suggest that in his later years he got initiated into Kriya, not necessarily through the yoga, yogoda, satsang, or self-realization path, but through another channel. So I did read that. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Mike. The Jnana path was something that he would have certainly made his own. And yeah, Reva?
Very quick point. I was going to say, like in the bit about how the houses were close together, it just kind of reiterated that thought for me, which I've always had since I was a kid, about how much of like India's mysticism, spirituality, intellectual hub is in like in Bengal and Kolkata, which I think this is in, and like how amazing it is, like because especially we'll come to it later, but he quotes Rabindranath Tagore talking about him. It's it's just, it can't be a coincidence that so much like amazingness comes from one place.
Yeah, that's another very good point. I did a bit of research on this actually once, and it turns out that Bengal was one of the first areas where the East India Company and the British established like a really important province there. So they invested exceptionally heavily in education and things like that. Not necessarily education for the locals, but education for themselves and their children that are living there. And obviously the very wealthy and the high caste and high class people would then also attend those schools and stuff. So I think there was an element of that there. But yeah, Bengal itself is I hope to go there later this year. But there could also, as you say, there's something in the water, Mike.
Yeah, I think the British then moved the capital to Delhi because there were too many uprisings in Bengal, right? They didn't feel safe there anymore. And one thing that Guruji mentions in one of his speeches, he says Kolkata is now becoming New York or something like that. He says that Kolkata will play a big role in the future as a center for, I don't know what it will be, maybe some kind of economic trade or something like that.
So let's talk about the description of this this lovely scientist and soul, beautiful soul as well. So he says firstly grave and retiring. So grave is an interesting word. I remember in the chant, "Oh God, beautiful," there's the word grave in there, isn't there? He says, "In the ocean, thou art grave." I always struggled with the concept of the divine as grave in the ocean as well. Reva?
Yeah, you know what? I always think that with that chant as well. And my interpretation of it is that he means deep. So I always feel like, oh, that's a bit of a negative word, grave. But then I'm like, no, it's not. It's not negative or positive. I'm putting the charge on it. So I actually feel like it's like a great depth. So in this sentence, if you usually like replace like grave with deep, then I think, yeah, you're giving him gravitas, right?
And if you look at his face, his eyes, his beautiful hair, it does certainly resonate with that word actually.
Is there
Mike?
a picture of him here? No.
Yeah, scroll.
Yeah.
There is in that. I know, Mike.
In French, as Priyank would probably know, or also in Italian, grave means like significant or of high importance. I have a nice picture. So that's kind of how I interpreted it, that the ocean is just something massive. But I'm English as a second language guy here, so I'm not an expert.
I'm afraid that the excuse is running too thin now. You've been speaking it like I reckon
lifelong excuse. No.
I reckon you've been speaking English more than you have German. So grave, and then the next word is retiring. Now that's another interesting word. So retiring, there's elements of seclusion in there, and we know that seclusion is important for us, especially for our meditations and silence and stillness and time to ourselves, etc. So grave and retiring. And certainly you can see that in his picture. That's in the Autobiography of a Yogi, which is a few pages further in the book. So and then he goes on to describe his physical appearance, actually. So that was kind of his aura. So then now this is his physical appearance, which he describes as handsome and robust, and in his 50s, he says. So my estimate was that he's about 52, based on Mukunda's age and what the timeline is, because it has to have been before he met Sri Yukteswar, which was in 1910. So that would be when he's 17. So yeah, he's probably 51 or 52 here. And then so he describes him as in his 50s, a robust man, thick hair, broad forehead, very, very academic, and abstracted eyes of a dreamer. I absolutely love those words. The abstracted eyes of a dreamer. Mike?
I wonder if he mentions that because maybe as a scientist, you need to have a bit of a connection up to the astral world or something and kind of get your inspirations from somewhere, a bit like an artist, right? So maybe he mentions this because he's maybe a guy who has his moments where he's very interiorized and has all of those ideas about physics and botany in his head swirling around.
Interesting that you connected the astral there. Yeah, that's a very unique thought. When I read it, I was purely thinking of it in the very human, the extraordinary human capability of an innovative thinker and kind of like a seer of creativity, such as like a Steve, Steve Jobs kind of personality comes to mind when I read Abstracted Eyes of a Dreamer, or in India maybe like Abdul Kalam, which is one of our revered previous presidents. So it's got a lot in there, isn't it? Those words. Might have to consider having my red highlighter for those words, which is interesting because it's a description of Jagadish Chandra Bose, but it's such a beautiful way of describing him. Reva, my red highlighter, such as the background of your wall. I'm using a red highlighter, so it just highlights my favorite passages and my favorite sentences in the project that we're undertaking. So,
I would like you to keep telling us which highlighter you're using, Brian, as we continue. We're keen to know.
Hope you're not just saying that in jest.
But do you know what? I thought the reason, when you first told us that you've written Babaji on your pen, I thought it was like some kind of affirmation vibe. Like you were like, I'm channeling Babaji when I write. Like I thought you were writing something.
I hope to. I hope to channel it one way or the other. Using all tools at my limited disposal. So yeah, the next line is one that I associated with Mike actually when I read the precision in his tones. I kind of feel that.
Thank you.
Feel you when I read that, Mike. I can feel the precision. Revealed a lifelong scientific habit, and this is a very nice kind of summary of the life of the soul that Jagadish Chandra Bose lived out, and the Leela that he played out in his life, isn't it, Mike?
Do you think he was a scientist many incarnations before as well? So he kind of became this scientist. He's got those scientific habits that make him like a scientist.
Indeed, you do bring with the incarnations. You do certainly bring habits from past lives, and perhaps this was one of his positive habits that he brought along with him. Laura?
I also love that we have a photograph And I've probably said this before, but I really feel like it's so purposefully placed whenever there's a photograph, and it brings us further into that reality. Like, it's been about, well, in my copy, 34 pages since we last had a photograph. So I think it could be very easy for the reader, particularly with all these, you know, saints and sages, to feel like, oh, I'm just reading a story. And it can get lost in the reality. But as soon as we get a photograph, it's like, okay. And especially for something like this, where it's very factual. Yeah, it's just really nice, I think, for the newbie reader who may have no experience with any of these new things that are coming up, to have the reality there, like in a visual form.
Indeed. Indeed. So let's move on. So the next sentence is that he has recently returned from an expedition to scientific societies of the West. Now, I don't know which societies he could be referring to, but he used to write, his papers used to be published in magazines like The Electrician in the United Kingdom, and the Institute of Electronic and Electrical Engineers, which I'm a member of here. And there's also a similar society in America as well. So we don't know which ones, but we could certainly say that those could be amongst them. And his papers were published in Longmans and Green Company as well, that big publisher that now does the Pearman's encyclopedias as well. So it could have been those as well. Mike?
And we have to bear in mind also that electricity was a rather new concept at this point, right? And as someone who was involved with like radio waves or the discovery of them, this is maybe now comparable to when we talk about AI or something. It was like a really cutting edge, state of the art field of discovery, very, very exciting field. So I'm guessing all of those people who were kind of super thrilled by the subject, they met internationally. And then he also studied in England for a while, right? Or he worked in England, did his postdocs there. So he might have gotten like an international circle of scientists that he was convening with.
So what you're saying, Mike, he's very good at networking.
Yeah, I can imagine him even in the early 1900s that he was already like, I don't know, there were no TED Talks back then, but I'm sure there was like symposiums about this, and he was like probably a very important speaker in those days.
And do you consider networking a dark art or a positive white art?
No, I mean the master of networking is Guruji, right? He's very good at it.
Indeed. So he's in touch with the society that probably has been ever since he left the United Kingdom, as we will discover later. Here's a bit of his biography is coming later. So said that the people of those society or their members have exhibited intense interest in his delicate instruments, which demonstrate the indivisible unity of life. Quite a profound statement, and one that I think that Guruji really would have taken on. And this is, I think, one of the reasons why this chapter is in this book. Aside from the fact that, you know, Bose is one of the most famous scientists in history, but secondly, that he's exposing all the threads that God kind of weaved him into the incarnation that he was, and this was certainly one of them, because the indivisible unity is something that is important in the lessons and the teachings that we follow and that we hold so dear to our hearts. And now it comes the first mention of the Crescograph. And if you look at a picture of Bose and a Crescograph, you wouldn't think it has much to do with biology or botany. You would think it's some exceptionally delicate instrument that's doing some sort of Morse code, or like doing, you know, it's weighing something of minute mass, you know, measuring gravity or something exceptionally minute such as that. But no, what he's doing is he's using his he's using his expertise in physics essentially and applying them to biology, isn't he? So he's using gears and smoked glass to essentially track and record the very, very minute movements that plants have. So then essentially it enlarges, as is said here, a few thousand times the impetus and like the different reactions plants have to various stimulus. And this is essentially what the Crescograph does. But I encourage you to look up pictures of the Crescograph and results and analysis before we get to the chapter, the later on section of the chapter, because it will make it much more meaningful. But we won't go into it too much here. Mike?
Yeah, you make a good point here. Like we said, Guruji said earlier, he went from the anorganic to the organic, right? And he took his everything he learned as an electrical engineer, or what he did before, and applied it to botany. And that way he had a unique point of view. And I guess that's often how great inventions happen, right? When you merge two fields together at the crossroads.
Indeed. Interdisciplinary is the way forward, apparently, for great innovations. So then there's a couple of footnotes here, and we have another footnote from quoting Emerson, and the Emerson quote is, Lauren, would you like to read it out? It's very nice. Number one, description.
I can't see it, so someone might have to.
All science is transcendental, or else passes away. Botany is now acquiring the right theory. The avatars of Brahma will presently be the textbooks of natural history. This is quite a mystical sentence. Avatars of Brahma. So the avatars of Brahma are essentially people of knowledge. So Valmiki, who was the author of the Ramayana, then there's Brihaspati and Kashyapa and Vyasa, all these exemplaries that are considered avatars of Brahma. So those are the literal, but he's relating this footnote, he's relating it to the unity, indivisible unity of life. So make of that what you will, but it's a lovely insertion of a footnote there to expand your horizon. And Emerson, as we know, is one of Guruji's favorite thinkers, and he quotes him. He must have quoted him 5 times now already. We're only in chapter 8. So, and then the other footnote is the Crescograph, I believe, and he describes the Latin derivation of the Crescograph, which is crescere, which is to increase. And apparently he was knighted for his invention, received a knighthood from back then, whatever royal was in charge, his or her majesty, in 1917. So that's pretty cool. So next we have essentially the commercial approach. So here, the next sentence, he says, Guruji says, "You've done much, sir, to hasten the embrace of the East and West with the impersonal arms of science." So this is Guruji's one of his favorite topics, is to blend and dovetail the East and West and the way of thinking and the achievements. And he's crediting both with that lovely theory and philosophy and ideal, isn't it, of unity. Before he talked about unity of individual unity of existence, and now he's trying to promote the unity of the East and the West, and crediting both with that paradigm. Mike?
Yes, that's kind of like Guruji is going to the West and teaching Eastern philosophy, Eastern kind of meditation, and when you have someone like Jagadish Chandra Bose going to England, getting a PhD, and then coming back to India and working there as a researcher, this is also something that kind of brings the cultures of East and West together. So in some ways they've been working on the same project like that.
Indeed. So next he says that he was embracing the East and West with the impersonal arms of science. So he's using science to bring the two warring partners together. Certainly was the case back then with colonialization and other things like that. So then there's a bit of autobiography of Jagadish Chandra Bose. He says, I was educated at Cambridge. I presume he doesn't mean Anglia Ruskin University, which is also at Cambridge. He means Cambridge. How admirable is the Western method, he's saying, to basically putting every theory to experimentation to verify its its trueness. And I think that is so true. It's so much truth in that method that it also applies to virtually everything. Like Guruji even tells us, like, I don't tell you to believe me blindly. Try. He says, try it, doesn't he? He says, try before you essentially buy. So this is something that we practice, in our meditations, and there's something that you taste even if you go to one of the self-realization fellowship centers for the first time. You can have a taste of this, so you can put that experiment into practice for yourself before you decide whether or not to go any further. So I really like that. So then he says that empirical procedure has gone hand in hand with the gift of introspection. That is my Eastern heritage. Such a lovely way of describing what the East are good at and how they can bring that quality and help, develop civilization, isn't it? So Eastern heritage, introspection is something, Reva, apparently you and I should have in abundance. Is that true for you?
A bit of both, maybe not enough either. I would describe. But yeah, I really like that kind of marrying of the two there. And it's a perfect sentence, isn't it? That empirical procedure has gone hand in hand with a gift for introspection. That is my Eastern heritage. It's like perfect, isn't it?
It is. It's too perfect to have been written by an ordinary soul, you might say. Or spoken by an ordinary soul, of which neither Jagadish Chandra Bose or Paramahansa Yogananda were. So the next line and the last line we'll cover is, together they have enabled me to sunder the silences of the natural realms long uncommunicative. There's a really powerful methods here. So he's essentially saying he's dug into the silence with such zeal that he's connected into it, and he's connected to realms that are usually, or for him, they were for a long time uncommunicative, which means that these inventions and these ideas didn't just come to him easily. He had to persevere. He had to really, really dig, isn't it, to get to the achievements that he has got to. That's a great line, Mike.
When he says introspection, does he mean introspection the way we kind of watch our thoughts and kind of go through them one by one and write a diary or journal? Or did he also mean some spiritual techniques, you think? Or did he, I wonder if he kind of used this abstract term to kind of we kind of not mentioned. Maybe also back in the day, it wasn't so popular as a scientist to say that you are religious or something. So maybe that was his science speak.
Indeed. Yeah, we don't know. It could be either, but both are quite worthy of inclusion for us to have in our lives. So it could be one or both. Gift of interpretation is good in both senses here for us. So
I also feel like, sorry.
Yeah, go on.
Sorry, I didn't put my hand up there, but just kind of on that whole kind of, I was educated at Cambridge, how admirable it is to that kind of experimental piece. I almost feel like that is also talking about, like, be wary of, like, on our Eastern side, the blind faithedness as well, because there's a lot in our culture, I'm not sure where it comes from, that is about, it's like that because it's like that. And you kind of, even parts of, like, growing up in a Hindu family, so many things that we did, like rituals, people didn't even actually know why you were doing, just doing it because you do it. And so, like, yeah, there's pros and cons on both sides, is what I'm saying, of the cultures.
Yep, I certainly resonate with that. Had one of my Indian SRF friends staying with me a few months ago, and we were talking about this very thing, Reva, and I thought I'd get some sympathy from him, because I was saying, because he's a disciple, and because I was saying, when I go, my mum makes me do, or has in my life has made me do so many different rituals, essentially, Vedic rituals, which usually involve, like, fire and things like that, and I always, I used to just do them because I had to, as opposed to do them with any belief or any devotion or any meditative approach, which may have been beneficial, but I used to resent having to do them. And I said now, I told my friend, now that I'm with Guruji, I feel that I don't, we're doing the ultimate sacrifice, or the ceremony, which is the Kriya practice. So all these external rituals are all absorbed in the internal ritual that we're doing with Kriya. So for that purpose, I now do not ever partake in any external ritual. And he's like, no, but Priyank, then you'll get your mum or your aunt or your cousin will get offended if you don't partake. And I said, well, I'm willing to run that risk for the sake of retaining my own spiritual sadhana that I'm doing, as opposed to blending and mixing everything. Yeah, that's just for me. I'm not for all the people out there that enjoy these rituals and get something out of them. To each their own, right? And who we don't know what essentially we don't know, do we? We don't know what impact they're having, positive or otherwise. So this the other thing about this last sentence, where he says the empirical approach and the introspection quality enabled him to sunder the silence. So he's saying that he would have, I think, been into his meditative practices from a young age, I dare say, to be able to achieve what he has, which means that whether he was initiated or not, he was practicing probably some pretty high techniques of meditation, and channeling that energy to all the inspirational achievements to achieve them as he did. So that's pretty nice. In terms of Jagadish Chandra Bose, as he said, he was educated in Cambridge, and he was born in India, and this would mean that to be educated in Cambridge, unless you got some significant scholarships, you have to be quite well off, and his family, I think, were well off, And so he went. He was born and raised in Bengal, and then he moved, or he did his university education in Cambridge. But as I said before that, he was actually going to study medicine in London, University of London. But he apparently quit because of allergies in health. And he said that, there's publishing that said that perhaps the chemicals used in dissection rooms did not agree with him. So he then for somehow got he got admission to Cambridge and studied there for natural sciences. And this is the one good thing about Cambridge, actually, as opposed to other universities. When you do engineering or science, so you do a general approach. So engineering is called general engineering, and you don't go into electronic or mechanical or civil, or you do a bit of everything, and then therefore you'd hope to come out a very rounded individual. And similarly,
did you study there? Sorry.
No, I didn't. No, I just did ordinary electronic engineering at Surrey. He did natural sciences. So in Cambridge, if you do science, you don't just do physics or biology or chemistry as you do in all other universities. You do natural sciences, and then in that you have to do all of those disciplines. So you can imagine how demanding it is to study that. So he had some pretty influential teachers, and hence, he got good connection, shall we say. And then he did some work there, some research there, and moved back to India and became a professor at Presidency College. And that is where he is currently in his life. And then we'll talk a bit later about the institute he developed and then his other experiments, shall we say, before he, his breakthrough in these other fields. But I think we'll end it there, unless anyone else has got any more. No? Thank you for joining us, everyone. Thank you, Reva.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, guys.
Hope to see you again soon. Jai Guru, everyone. Take care.
Jai Guru.
Bye.